Welcome back to Cars and Zebras. We're in the garage today with the 1969 Chevelle, and we got to do a little bit more work on the carburetor. It seems to be running a little bit rich, so we're going to check the float levels, set the idle mixture screws, and also check the power valve. But first, we got to get it warmed up, so I'm going to take it for a quick drive. Alright, we got her warmed up, and let's get to work. We'll pull the air cleaner off, and then I'm going to show you all the tools I'm using. There really aren't that many. The first thing you're going to need is a vacuum gauge, and some people say that they can tune their idle mixture screws just by listening to the car, and I think that's great, but it only takes a couple seconds to get this thing set up, so I always use one. And if you don't have a vacuum gauge and you're looking to buy one, well, this specific model is really affordable, it works well. I'll put a link to my Amazon affiliates page in the description box, so feel free to click on that, and then you can take a look at it on Amazon. You'll also need a flathead screwdriver, a 5/8 wrench, and then I like to use a coat hanger to actually hang up my vacuum gauge so I can see it better. I should also say that you guys should probably have a fire extinguisher ready just in case. The first thing we're going to do is check the float level, so while the car is running, we're going to pull the fuel level sight plug. There's one for the primaries, and then we'll have to check another one for the secondaries that's located near the back of the carburetor. Ideally, you should put down some type of cloth to catch any gasoline, but I forgot to do that. Once that plug is removed, you just get the car shaking a little bit like it's prom night, and you should see a little bit of gasoline come out of that sight plug. You can see just a little bit of gasoline come out of mine, so this float is likely set correctly. If you had no gasoline, the float is too low, or if when you remove the plug you had a ton of gas spill out, then your float's probably too high. And don't worry, I'll explain how to adjust the float level, but first we have to check the secondaries. It's the same procedure. So again, you remove that fuel level sight plug, and then you get that car rocking for about 2 or 3 seconds like it's your first time. Or in my case, every time. I personally go for speed records. And just like the primaries, this float level seems just fine, but I'll still show you how to adjust them if need be. Here we are at the float level adjustment nut, and Holley recommends doing this part with the car off. You'll notice there's a screw on top. That's actually just a locking screw. It has nothing to do with the fuel level itself, but we do have to loosen that up so we can adjust the nut. Here's where you're going to need your 5/8 wrench to hold the nut, and then you just break the screw loose. If the fuel levels are too low, then you got to turn the nut counterclockwise, that'll raise the float. Or if they're too high, then you got to go clockwise, that will lower the float. And then you just lock it down with the nut, you fire up the car again and recheck that sight plug. Obviously, I'm not going to adjust mine because it seems to be doing alright. Next, we're going to check and adjust all of the idle mixture screws. This carburetor has 4 of them, but yours might only have 2 or even 1. Here's that first idle mixture screw. And the second one. The third one's kind of hidden in there. And then, of course, the final 4th one. If you think your idle mixture is completely off, then Holley recommends you tighten all the idle mixture screws until they seat, and then you back them out about 1.5 turns as a starting point. The next thing is that you'll have to get your vacuum gauge attached, and you want to have that attached to manifold vacuum, not carburetor vacuum. Usually just underneath the front of the carburetor, you'll find a little port that you can use. Again, you should be doing all this while the car is warmed up. If you have a manual transmission, you should put it in neutral, and if it's an automatic transmission, you should put it in drive and have somebody hold the brake for you. Unfortunately, my girlfriend's working right now and I don't feel like talking to my neighbors, so I'm going to put it in neutral, and then when someone else is around to help me out, then I'll recheck it in drive. You can see that the baseline's between 9 and 10, and that's definitely not ideal. This car does have a rather aggressive cam, but I don't know the exact specs. I would think that around 14 inches is probably as good as this is going to get. Next, we'll adjust the idle mixture screws for the highest vacuum reading. I usually do this with a 1/4 turn at a time, but keep in mind, whatever you do to one screw, you should be doing to all of them. Interestingly, I found that all of the idle mixture screws on this car were at completely different settings by the previous owner. Some were at a 1/2 turn, others were at 2 full turns, so I'm not too surprised that this thing was only pulling about 9 inches of vacuum. You can see with some quick adjustments, we've already got that vacuum gauge up to 11.
The numbers all go to 11.
But give me just a little bit more time, I think I can get it better than that. After messing around with the carburetor for a few more minutes, I got it up to about 14. I don't think it's getting any better than that. After you've set the idle mixture screws, you might have to adjust the idle speed just a little bit. For example, this car previously at hot idle was about 600 RPM, and now with all these adjustments, it's at about 700 RPM, so I gotta turn that down just a little bit. How about we do a little bit of before and after action? So here's the before. It definitely seems a lot smoother to me, and the last thing that we need to check is that power valve. And we're back at the carburetor, so let's get the fuel line disconnected first. We'll move that out of the way and put down a rag because there's definitely going to be a little bit of gas that comes out of that fuel bowl. We'll unscrew all of those bolts and that fuel bowl should pull right off. Or not, sometimes that happens. Just use a rubber mallet to gently tap it loose. And don't forget to pull off that vacuum line. We'll just gently pull that gasket off. It looks like it's intact, so I'm gonna reuse it. And right here you'll see that power valve. Typically on this surface it'll say the size of the valve, but this one's not labeled, so how about we remove it real quick? Everything looks to be in pretty good shape, and I actually know that this valve is working because when I was adjusting those idle mixture screws, if I had them turned all the way in, the car would stall out. That means the power valve is not blown. And I know you guys can't see this, but I did find a size on the outer ring of it, and it says that it's a 6.5. That should be fine. You want your power valve to be about half of what your manifold vacuum pressure is at idle. Ours was about 12 to 14, give or take, so 6.5 should work. Alright, and then you just put everything back together in reverse order, and don't forget to hook up that vacuum line like I almost did. And after all that, let's do the fun part. We'll get in and take it for a drive.